You're watching Two on One, the internet's top sensation, where two disciples theologians speak to a theologian of their choosing on the topic of their choosing, based on, of course, the intersections of theology, pop culture, and as time allows. I'm one of your co-hosts, the Reverend Arthur Stewart.
I like that you would explain the concept of this show after 100 episodes. Well done.
Thank you very much.
I rely on you for everything because I am your other co-host, the Reverend Stephanie Kendall, who does not have all of this together. Arthur keeps this show running, y'all. So
every episode has the potential to be somebody's first episode and somebody's favorite episode, and listen, I don't want to leave any deuces behind.
I love that. That's a good practice for the church because I talk about this often, right? Like, what insider language are we using? So I appreciate that you hold us to explaining and introducing and welcoming new deuces.
Well, you know, RDW and CYF are going to be having an FF dinner on Friday, so make sure you call the church office at a number we're not going to give you to RSVP.
Or turn your attention to this night or tonight's biggest episode of whatever we're watching. Today happens to be The Simpsons, which I was really excited to watch.
I'm so glad that we've burst the Simpsons bubble and we've finally broken through this barrier. I'm excited to have this conversation. I have a whole lot of feelings and a whole lot of thoughts, and I'm going to turn those into actions. But hey, before we get into really good storytelling, because The Simpsons for 30 years has been really intentionally somewhat engaging the culture. I have opinions after season 8. But if you want to talk about longevity, quality, and community, look no further than Jeff Wunrow Designs.
Ooh, that was a great transition.
Thank you. Well, celebrating 17 years of making ordinary time extraordinary, Jeff Wunrow Designs provides liturgical textiles of all varieties, shapes, sizes, denominations, and I'm going to say material too.
I think he does do material. I think material is absolutely a part of the diversity that Jeff brings to his products and everything in such. Like you have big opinions on The Simpsons, I have big opinions on liturgical textile wear, and which is very true. And all but like 3 of my stoles are of Jeff Wunrow, and I say this all the time. I wear my Wunrow stoles. I talk about them. I need like Jeff cards now because I've taken to taking pictures of the tag that's in it that says his name to give out to people when they stop me on the street and say, "Where did you get that stole?"
And we should say that when Spiff says that she has stoles of Jeff Wunrow, she means of the house of Jeff Wunrow. They're not actually pictures of Jeff Wunrow on a stole. Side note, we're going to be at General Assembly in 2023, and I'm going to petition that we be right next to Jeff Wunrow Designs. But if not, we need to make our own stoles that are just pictures of Jeff Wunrow, except he'd probably drop us as his sponsored people.
No, yes and no. I'm here for all of that. I will be at General Assembly, I've been told. And I can't wait to see all of you there next July and August. It's like the cusp.
If you want to look your best at General Assembly or before then or after then, head over to jeffwunrow.com. Check out the online catalog of stoles, paraments, banners, frontals, altar accessories, liturgical face masks, copes, chasubles, and miters. I really hope we can talk Jeff into making us 2-on-1 miters.
Oh my gosh, that's all I want. Yeah, I would love that. But you deuces know that you have the exclusive Jeff Wunrow code for 2-on-1, which is 2-on-1-15. So spell out 2-on-1, throw 15 at the end, and that gets you 15% off your entire stole order.
That means 1 stole, that means 5 stoles, that means 8 stoles. You could get stoles of the same design for every liturgical season, both Advent and not Advent, all at once, 15% off. You could also technically do 8 individual orders using that code each and every time.
That's true.
Yeah.
You can.
Or 4 and 4. Or 2 and 2 and 3 and 1.
Okay, now we're just getting into math. And let's get out of math.
Let's get out of math.
To The Simpsons.
That's right. Head over to jeffwunrow.com. I know you already said it, but do it one more time after the show. All right, I'm going to bring in Chris.
I am so excited for this guest. This is, sometimes we have different guests that come on that are different friends of ours, and this is a friend of mine that I'm super excited to have on. Chris, thanks for joining us on 2-on-1.
Thank you for having me here. I'm very, very, very excited to talk about today's topic.
I am too. As I told Spiff,
Really, it's a gift to Arthur. It's like,
feelings and
Arthur,
thoughts.
Chris, here's the gift you both needed, which was a
It's
2-on-1 show on The Simpsons.
it's actually in my 2-on-1 bio where I'm like, I really want to do an episode on the one where it turns out Seymour Skinner isn't Seymour Skinner, and they just decide to literally railroad it out, and that's the end of the golden age of The Simpsons. But this episode is good too. Before we get into it, Chris, who are you? What do you do? What's your context? What's your true joy in life?
So I am a pastor, and Spiff and I, we met at Bright Divinity. We were seminarians together. She graduated before I did because she was much more ambitious than I was.
I think I was just more focused to get out of Texas, to be clear.
To be fair, I don't know many people who are less or more ambitious than Stephanie Kendall.
Yes,
So
I would concur. I've lived my entire life within about a 15-mile radius. I'm the opposite of a world traveler. I've lived in Fort Worth and Burleson pretty much my whole life. I actually went to TCU for my undergrad as well. I was a music major there.
Oh, good.
And so, yes, go Frogs.
Exactly, go Frogs.
I did my undergrad in classical guitar, which is kind of how I found the church to begin with, because I was my college years was my sabbatical from the church, so to speak. And the after I graduated with a music degree, that's kind of how I found my way back into the church, and where I started working right out of college. That church is the place that I'm still employed at right now. So this January will mark 20 years that I've been here at this church.
Fantastic.
So, and outside of that, I have a wife and 2 kids, and I love the outdoors.
See, you're not a world traveler, but I always call myself an indoors kid. So we all got something. I know it's weird for a nearly 40-year-old to call himself an indoors kid, but you know exactly what I'm like now.
Yeah. I mean, anybody that's watched, you're from Bunk Hive. From anyone that's watched Wet Hot American Summer. Well, Chris, I'm really excited to have you here. You suggested Simpsons. Well, you suggested I think you called it the only show or the greatest show. What was you? And
the greatest show ever.
Yeah, the greatest show ever. And I needed clarity. Like, what might that be? And I feel like you really missed, like, you should have been texting Arthur, because Arthur would have written back immediately The Simpsons. Yes. And I was like, is like Sons of Anarchy? Like, what are we talking here?
So, for those of you who are watching along or listening along or playing along at home, we're talking about season 4, episode 3, Homer the Heretic of The Simpsons. It aired originally in the fall of 1992. I just want us to pause for a moment and recognize it's 30 years old. And in short,
I don't think any of us like that phrase.
It is Homer Simpson deciding to no longer attend church and kind of going on a walkabout, like a spiritual journey of self-discovery. And forgive me if walkabout is an appropriative term. I just realized it may be, and I'm going to walk that back. But he goes on a spiritual journey, has a theophany, makes some decisions, comedy ensues.
Chris, tell us a little bit about why this episode, when given the stratosphere of the world of television and film, you knew exactly what show and episode you wanted.
Well, Simpsons, the show, simply because, especially if you were a child of the 80s, which of course I was, that was such, it was like the zeitgeist, for lack of a better term, for that era. And whether you watched it or you didn't, you knew about it, and how much it elicited emotion from people. Either they loved it or they hated it. It was polarizing in many ways. And as a kid growing up watching it, I remember being one of the only kids in my school that was allowed to watch it. A lot of my fellow friends couldn't watch it, but I had the blessing of a mom who was a hippie, and like we could watch whatever we wanted. And that was like our family show, was The Simpsons. So it was really weird to me that families couldn't watch it. But then as I got older and really started to pay attention to what the show was doing, I thought they were ahead of their time in many ways. I thought they were their comedy was pretty smart. And then just the different ways, the different commentaries that they were kind of tapping into as things were rolling along. I thought, man, there's some really cool things happening. Yet at the same time, at the very surface level, some of the comedy was just very base level stuff that was just stupid funny. And I have a need for both of those things in my life. But then this specific episode, we're talking theology and Hollywood. This was my first thought whenever I was thinking The Simpsons, what episode would it be? This was my first thought because I thought it would open the door for some really good theological conversations, but really thinking about how the church functions and how the world views the church. And really getting into the show, almost the very first line of that episode opens the door into the conversation. Homer's not wanting to get out of bed. It's really cold outside, and Marge is trying to wake him up. And the first conversation, she's like, Homer, get up. It's time for church. And he says, I don't want to go. And her response is, but you have to go. It's church. Like that right there. Like you could spend some time just unpacking that one.
I think you should. I mean,
And before we do, because I agree that we should do in this, I do want to give just a little bit of background on this too, or at least so the Simpsons have three major issues that have occurred. Number one is that the life they present is no longer sustainable. In 1992, Homer Simpson is the only parent who works. They're able to afford a 3-bedroom house, feed their kids. Like, they're never rich, they're never well off, but they're solidly middle class. He has no skills, but he still has job security, and he has a union. If anybody wants to come and do Lisa versus braces, or Lisa gets braces, that's also
that's a great episode.
And there's also, as church begins on it, they're in a blizzard, and the majority of people in the town still show up to the church because of a sense of obligation.
Yes,
that's the most shocking part in this, and I think that's it. It's not if you want to go, you have to go. It's church. Sorry, yeah, I think it's an important thing in there. And also, Homer hasn't become a jerk ass yet. Literally the phrase that is used, because I like it. And Flanders isn't Flanderized. He isn't only about being weirdly religious. Okay.
Yeah, but that opens the door into the conversation. Like, you have to go. It's church. And so not only does it say something about the town, about the Simpsons, but also about 1992,
right?
And where the culture was at that time. And how it all kind of plays out in the blizzard, and he doesn't want to go. And then, but also, like, there's this, the uniform that he has to wear. Like, she gets out his church clothes. Like, these are the clothes that you only wear to church. And then when he rips them, he's like, that's it. I'm done. I've had enough things go wrong. I'm not going. And Marge has had enough. She's like, okay, I'm not dealing with you. I want to take the kids and go to church. And that whole scene, it's really funny whenever the whole town's at the church, and that the service itself is outstanding. You know, the Reverend Lovejoy and the reading of Lamentations, and in his words, the long version.
The long version.
Like, have y'all ever preached from Lamentations? You have?
I have not.
Okay.
I've done it once. I have a friend who it's her favorite book, and she's a hospice chaplain, and she's like, it tracks. And I was like, and so I just challenged myself to one day preach from it, because it does not, I don't think it comes up in the lectionary, does it? It's not something that I had preached from before. And I was like, I want to try it. I want to learn what this book has to teach me. And so I immediately, that was the first thing that I caught on to, was, you have to go versus want to go, all of that. Because in 92, I was not going to church. My family we were not church people. And so this sense of obligation to go to church was actually never instilled in me until I became a pastor. And then I was like, no, you have to. It's your job. You have to show up. And so for me, and I think that is what I liked about this episode a lot, is that, like, I don't believe in that. I believe that it exists for people. I don't believe in my part in that, of making people show up to church, because for me, if I have given you a sense of kind of obligation and not desire to come to church, then like that's on me. Like if you don't want to come to church, that's not on you, that's on me. And I think that this episode holds that well. Like, what does it actually mean to want to go and belong and be a part of this beloved community? And what does it mean to not want to go, but also to let that be okay and see God at work in all sorts of different people and ways and things?
And see, I hear where you're coming from on it. And I will also say we've been averaging 60 people at good old Riverside the last few weeks.
On your Riverside?
80 yesterday, Riverside Christian Church in Wichita, Kansas. And the difference between 60 people in worship and 80 people in worship is palpable. The energy is different. The community is different. I have a friend right now who she was like, the people still give, but they all just stream on church. And, you know, I only have a fifth of the people showing up. And I said, you have a church where nobody shows up and they still give money? Let's swap. But there is something about it. And part of the community, you know, what's the old joke? Church is like a sewer. What you get out of it depends on what you put into it.
Wow.
Hadn't heard that one, but I mean, it tracks. I mean,
but Chris, I mean, what do you think about this? Break the tie on that. Like, should it be where's the level of attraction?
Are we obligated to go to church?
See, that's the thing. I think there's an obligation, and this is kind of what I one of the things I love about The Simpsons is at the same time, it's still just a cartoon, and they really take advantage of the fact that they're not going to be consistent across the board. And sometimes and there are episodes, like there's one scene you'll see two different Homer Simpsons in the same shot just to make a joke at the fact, hey, we're a cartoon. We can kind of do whatever we want to do here. And so with this, like the obligation, I think there's an obligation. I think there should be an obligation, but there's some sort of like middle ground between like the character that I see in Homer and the character that I see in Marge, is that there's an obligation to be a part of a community on the terms that make sense to you. And I think what I love about the episode is in some ways it does kind of mirror Homer's journey, kind of mirrors the 4 years that I was in college and what I was doing, is that, you know, we respond in polarizing ways. Whenever we want to rebel from something, we kind of rebel as far as we can. And so Homer, the first opportunity he's got to kind of have this get out of jail free card, not have to go to church on Sunday morning, what does he do? He kind of lays around and does nothing. Like, I was trying to make a connection with like the 7 deadly sins in that old tradition and see how many of those like he digs into, and he digs into like 3 of them right away. But like he's got this unlimited time, but what does he do with it? He nothing. Like he does nothing, which for one day, hey, that's okay. Sometimes you need a break, right? You need a break. But then time goes on and he doesn't use that time well. I think there's a power and a sense of obligation to be accountable to a community. So, you know what, I'm going to do something. I'm going to bring something of worth to this community for whatever reason. And it shouldn't be based on like a transactional thing that I'm doing this because they can then return the favor. Mm-hmm. It's just, hey man, that's how we engage in life together, is in a sense of obligation to each other.
And that's it. That's the transactional thing. And that's where it comes into it, because I think Marge is getting something. Marge expects something out of it by attending.
Yes. And
worship is just about being in God's presence and actually ultimately discovering some sort of sense of the divine working in us and through us and for us. Like, that's fine. Yeah. It's not to what does Homer say at the end? You are a vengeful God. You were all smiting one, and I tell me who shall be smoten. And
they will be smoten.
Exactly. And and that's where it comes into it. It's worship. If it's just going to hear, by the way, Lovejoy is a TCU grad. They established that in like season 22, the bishop visits, and he's like, when we were roommates at Texas Christian, and I've always taken that to mean bright.
I'm taking it to mean bright as well.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Simpsons with the bright shout out.
But to listen to Lovejoy effuse about Lamentations, there's no gospel in that. And I think gospel is found in community, and gospel is found in relationship, and gospel is found in coming together on that. What's the difference between Homer staying home and Homer going to church? And if they're not different, that's the problem.
Yeah, and interestingly, whenever he's going on that rant in Lamentations, like the Simpson family in the pew is envisioning this picture that Lovejoy's talking about hell, and they're seeing that as this wonderful escape from this church pew that they're currently sitting in this worship service that's just horrid, for lack of a better term.
Well, and that was one of the things. I work for the first time in a place where it snows, and like I did not realize that weather in this way like affects how I lead a congregation, right? Like if it is like, it was one of the first things that I noticed, again, because we weren't taught this necessarily at Bright, where it's like, hey, like, you're hit over the head with context matters, but we forget to say like, your context also matters in both your leadership and interpretation. Like we do to an extent, but not in like the largest sense possible. Right. And so like the very first time I was like trying to figure out how I was going to get to work, because it had been, snow and icy, and I was like slipping all over the place. And then like, it was just like, no, we don't expect people to come and do this. We just cancel the in-person unsafe gathering, and we gather online, or we do something different. And so I like, the first thing I noticed was like, oh, Lovejoy absolutely, like, the expectation to be there is because he is expecting them to be there, like it, with no furnace. Like, it's not healthy. It's not a healthy relationship that he has put out there to say like, you matter, your body matters, your safety matters. Also, the thing that bothered me most of the entire episode, and I don't know if it's maybe just because I'm a woman, but like everyone had left. Marge's car is not starting, right, and she's just there by herself with 3 little kids, yeah, like in the freeze of life. And I was like, this is bad community, and like also like just a nightmare for a woman who can't turn on these. Not that she's just a woman, but just like anybody.
That was the greatest condemnation of the church, because that absolutely happens in congregations all the time, 1992 and 2022. It is worship's over, everybody run for the doors, get out.
It's also why I make sure that I am the last one to leave, unless I've assigned someone to be the last one to leave, because I make sure my people get home safely. Yeah. Because I've been that person that, I get in my car, I check my phone, I wait for my car to warm, whatever that is. And then all of a sudden I've run out of gas because I'm dumb. And that's happened to me on more than one occasion. But I know, listen. But for those of you that are watching, Arthur's giving me a face. So
I've never run out of gas, because there's a gauge that says how much gas is left and a light that says you need.
Listen, I live on the edge. And if you're sometimes when your car freezes, that gauge does not always accurately detect how much gas is in your car. Yeah. Not that was my excuse, because this happened in Southern California, but I'm gonna lean it. But anyways, that was very much for me the condemnation of community, of the church, of like, why is Marge putting in all this time? Why does it matter to Marge? And honestly, I think in part it's the kids. I think that she is in a space where she's like, I feel obligatory. I'm raising these children. They need community. And I think the emotional weight of parenting is mostly put on Marge. And Homer is, running free. I don't think that it's bad that we all take that time and space off. I thought it was hysterical that like the excuse used by Homer is like, God came to me in a dream, because not only is that biblically based, it's just like, you can't, like, what are you going to do? Be like, no, Okay, like how do we as Christians reconcile things that the miracles and the things that happen biblically with
what happens if somebody walks into your office and says, God spoke to me in a dream and
exactly? I'm usually curious about what God said, but
yeah, I think it's one of that dream that he has with God is that I don't know, it's real subtle, but God actually has
five fingers.
Yeah,
Yes.
5 fingers.
What does that mean in a world where people have 4 fingers? Right,
Yeah.
right. Thank you.
It's really funny that it plays out, and the dream itself is
Chris,
really funny.
I need to you just made Arthur's moment, because before we brought you in, he was talking about the 4 fingers, and I was like, oh, this has got to be a thing. And so I need to let you two rant, just go on that.
And also, why doesn't God know that the St. Louis football Cardinals moved to Arizona?
Yes. Like God is checked out now. And I'm saying God is a he because in this episode, they've got God anthropomorphized into this like, I don't know, Father Time type figure, but you never see God's face. Right. You just see the beard. But yeah, God does all of these things. There's some funny things about that dream, and see, how do you unpack that? How much of that is like, do they intend to be legitimately God appearing to Homer, or is God just a reflection of Homer's desire playing out in the dream? All of these sort of things happening.
Is Homer returning the favor of a Majo Day, and making God in his own image in order to justify his own things?
Yeah, and because that's part of like this idea of obligation. You go to church out of obligation, or do you follow Homer's path? And really, you're trying to navigate the space between those 2 points. But with Homer, what you see is kind of this disregard of like, I no longer have this obligation. So I am completely alone in my universe, and I'm going to do whatever I want. I'm going to follow my most basic, immediate desire with no regard about how that impacts the world around me, to the point that I'm going to fall asleep with a cigar in my mouth and allow it to just burn the house down around me and make everybody else have to pick me up.
So and that's kind of fascinating. So I mean, Homer Simpson is a glutton, right? I don't know if you're familiar with Enneagram stuff. Homer's a 7, at least in the early seasons of The Simpsons.
Yeah.
We're also in the time when Simpsons, meta-wise, it's transitioning from a show about Bart Simpson into a show about Homer and Homer's adventures or misadventures. There was the bit where he was very much Francis of Assisi in the robe and with animals like flocking to him, and Francis is very much a 7 on the Enneagram as well. And I think it's an important thing that the made-up religious holiday that gets him out of going to work is the Feast of Maximum Occupancy, which also speaks to his gluttony, which of course is also an Enneagram 7 type of thing. But right, he's concerned about making his own appetites fulfilled, like the space waffle. I might share my recipe for space waffles, by the way, because we did figure out how to do it. We don't wrap it around a stick of butter, but like there's a caramel sauce, there's some smokiness to it. It's really
liquid
good.
Smoke.
Right. Liquid smoke.
We'll put up a recipe. Yeah, that's the word. I'm like, why recipe? Listen, I'm still kind of on Hawaiian time, not gonna lie. So
no, you're in the aloha spirit. So I guess the question is this: how do we use religion, be it organized or personal, to justify our own misgivings, our own biases, and our own unwillingness to see God at work? Because I think the whole message of this episode is that God's going to work as God is going to work.
Yeah.
Like how do we address like when we just make our own feasts of maximum occupancy and call it divinely ordained?
Yeah, and then the other part of that too is at the end of that first dream, God tells Homer, "Hey, I've got to go. I need to go appear in like a tortilla or something in Mexico or something." And they're how do you interpret that? Is that part of the joke? Like people can say they see God anywhere, or is that a way of saying, okay, God really is showing up and God's taking time to appear in this tortilla in Mexico? What do you do with that? And how do you navigate, okay, this is what I want. This is what I think is right. And so I'm going to figure out how to superimpose God into my own desire. And knowing that we do that all the time.
Or
Go ahead.
Oh no, but what happens when theophany is theophany? Like coming
Yeah,
back around
when
to this.
it's
Yeah.
legit.
What if God is actually speaking to someone? I had a friend who was a psych ward, an ER psych, and I said, "How many times did you meet Jesus Christ?" And she leaned into me and she goes, "Arthur, there were about 8 times a night usually that people would come in having had a psychotic break and claim that they were the manifestation and the second coming of Jesus Christ." I said, "Wow, 8 times a night?" She was like, "It was intense and severe." And she's like, and 99.98% of me knew that wasn't the case and they were having a psychotic break. And 0.02% of me thought, but what if this is a test?
Yeah.
And what I like about it is she said, so therefore I treated every patient like he or she or they were Jesus Christ. And I think about that a lot. So
Yeah.
what if the theophany is meant to shake us up? Like what? And Lovejoy did the right thing by Homer. Lovejoy came and said, I want you to reconsider church. And the community did the right thing by Homer, even though he was a selfish glutton.
Yeah.
And what does it mean then to say that Homer has some divinity to him, even if he's projecting his own gluttony into an image of the divine with 5 fingers, more fingers to grab things with?
But I also think that's part of the journey that so many go through is you grow up, or at some point you find a church and it becomes something that you do, but then it becomes an obligation. And then in Homer's case, what do? You rebel against that. Okay, I'm going to do the opposite. I'm going to completely forget about everybody, and I'm only going to think about my own desire.
Right.
And then eventually that plays out the way that it does for Homer. And then he comes back. Now, that last scene is great because he is back at church. He's in that front pew, front and center, and he's snoring logs in the middle of Lovejoy's sermon. But like he's kind of navigating that space between obligation, forget obligation, and then what do? We try to figure out, okay, this wasn't healthy. This wasn't healthy. Where do I exist in this religious space in a healthy way?
I really liked that ending. I thought, like, well, because this episode kind of revolves around the connection between God and Homer, which is, as we see, showing up in his dreams. For me, at that last piece, I was like, oh, he's in the, why do I have to go to the building, right? He's in that building because it means something to be in community. It means something to his family. It means something to his community for him to physically be there. But where he has connected most frequently, I guess, with God has been in his dreams. Now, I'm not saying he probably just fell asleep, because the joke is that he just kind of fell asleep and all of that. But at the same time, we can't discount that, like, we have now also witnessed God coming into that space through his dreams, and in that kind of mental space for Homer. So it's not a completely disconnected way of experiencing God for Homer. And I don't know, I really like that. I both did and didn't love the way in which they being the writers and the creators of this show in this space engaged other religions. I love that he was like, when God was like, I'm gonna go show up in a tortilla, I was like, cool. So we've got different cultures in which are all kind of understanding that God shows up in different ways. Like, I'm taking also Lovejoy to be Protestant in some regard, like they're not Catholic, right? And I'm assuming also you're gonna
It's probably some form of Presbyterianism because of I never get his name right, because of Elijah Lovejoy. But Lovejoy was a Presbyterian activist in Illinois, was murdered. They point towards Presbyterianism, but then they later name it as like it's a completely yoked church. It's like the Presbylutheran Church of America or something. Sorry.
Sure. Exactly. But it's not, but those in Mexico that he's showing up to are probably Catholic, right? Yeah. I mean, like, so that there's engagement, like there's ecumenical engagement there. And then he goes into 7-Eleven and Apu's got Ganesha, and I was like, ooh, that was not done well. No. But there was the recognition that other religions exist. And then it was like, okay, but there's 700 million of us or whatever. Like, good on you for coming back, but at the same time being like, I don't know. I appreciated the ways in which both God was very expansive, and then also you still see these limitations because of contextual understanding and engagement with neighbor.
Right.
And part of it is the 90s. I mean, it's Hank Azaria is not an East Indian, and Hank Azaria was playing a stereotypical accent. It was an Indian man working in 7-Eleven, where they just played up stereotypes. And really, it just gets much worse before it gets better in this coming season, where Hank Azaria no longer voices him.
Right.
The cheap joke of be they Catholics or Christians or Protestants or Jews or miscellaneous. Yeah, which honestly, I'm glad that he got the response of 700 million of us can't be wrong. But you do bring up a good point. Like there's a lot of good in this, and then there's still the edges that are very sharp and frayed.
But that's the church. I think that's why this episode still holds. We named it. It's 30 years old, and it still holds true. We could all be like, oh gosh, yes, that is exactly. I know that church. I know that pastor. I know those people.
So speaking of those people, why wasn't Flanders in church?
That's a good question. I didn't notice that. He's not in that scene, is he? Because
Ned Flanders runs into the house, and this is my definition of ministry, and it always has been. I'm actually going to bring this out again. My dad's response to me when I said I'm going to seminary was to buy me the Reverend Lovejoy Simpsons playset. So thank you, Dad. And I think
it's all over, people.
I didn't mean to do that one. But when Flanders throws the mattress out the window, and then Flanders, oh Lord, make my aim good and true, and he throws Homer out, and he immediately like starfishes back. Flanders' prayer is fine, and then he jumps out and like backflips back into the house to save Homer again. It's that right there is ministry, and I don't care what anybody else says. That is 100% what ministry is every single day. But yeah, why wasn't it a big deal for Flanders to take a Sunday off after they chase Homer through town singing "Rise and Shine" and give God the glory?
I assumed they were a different denomination, to be really honest. I didn't notice that he wasn't in church, and I realized that like the point is that everyone in Springfield goes to this one church. But like the engagement around Homer not being in church with everyone else, and then the response of Flanders, like entire Flanders family gives, I assumed that they were a different type of
and they should be. I'm sorry, I jumped on your point.
No, as someone who I will say, like, I watched maybe the first 3 seasons, probably 4 seasons of The Simpsons growing up. I very much was like, I'm going to play the saxophone like Lisa. And that is how in 2nd grade, Spiff picked up the saxophone for two years and then put it down. But like, it's not influential. Like, I absolutely, like, Chris, you're totally right when you said early on, like, this is a part of the zeitgeist of who we are, and it continues. But I wasn't like a big Simpsons-y person. And so I don't know. I think that I didn't notice, and so I just assumed he felt in modern 2022 context, he felt evangelical. Flanders feels very evangelical. And the fact that, like, not just that they showed up singing a song, like, that's not intentionally the one thing, but like that they continued singing the same song at him was like as if this is going to work. Like, it has to. We have one tool, and here it is. And I was like, oh God, I know those people too.
And that whole car chasing scene was like, I don't know, it was like an evening crime show from the late 80s, that whole bit of him going onto the trash heap. That was brilliant. But at the end, though, like, what I found funny, but also I think redeeming about the whole episode was that the truest sense of community that you got, the truest sense of ministry that you got, was not in the church. And it was not that experience, that mortgage wasn't held by people in the church. I mean, it was this community of this very ecumenical gathering of people that were simply serving out of obligation, like almost like kind of why Marge is going into church in the first place, but with a lot more depth to it, because I mean, they're putting their lives on the line and going out of their way to save this one person who's kind of basically been giving the middle finger to all of them the whole episode. Because I think everybody that's in his kitchen helping him at the end, at some point in that episode, he's offended them one way or another, yet they all come to his aid out of an obligation to each other. And so like that, you get that strong communal feel there in his kitchen as their house was just about to burn down.
Well, so and this might go a little further out of the episode, more into the idea of Springfield as a concept, right? So the Simpsons movie, we're waiting for an episode on that. Maybe Chris, you'll consider that as well. The whole concept is that the Simpsons betray Springfield, and that's the problem.
Yeah.
If you are in, you are in, and if you are an outsider, you probably won't stay. And there's very much an ecclesiology to that, which is terrifying, because it is our loyalty becomes to what is, not what could be. But I could be overthinking that or stepping outside of it. So
what are we supposed to do when Homer points out, Flanders is the most faithful person he knows, right? And his house caught on fire. And then it's like, and then it goes out and you get the rainbow. And I was like, oh, that's a Noah throwback real hard. And then I thought of Arthur, who has a deep desire.
Chris, you can join in our conspiracy. I'm going to start breaking into churches, and I'm going to start painting naked, dead, drowned bodies in their Noah's Ark murals in nurseries, because they missed the entire point of the story.
Yeah.
Sorry. A vengeful God, who shall be smoten?
But I turned to that and I was like, but that whole thing is right there, is that you can see God at work where you want to see God. You can see God at work where God is actually at work, and you can see God you can see God anywhere, and which is real, which isn't and doesn't matter, was really my thought on that, right? Like, if God put out Flanders House, or if the fire people put out Flanders House, doesn't matter if Flanders House gets put out. Right. And so I was like, oh, I mean, and I think that's what this whole episode points us to, right? Is points you back towards community. Where do you find and how do you support and live into community?
Yeah, and how you view the event, and how you view, so there's one way of looking at it.
Do you want to define event for us? No, I'm just kidding.
Derrida.
So
exactly.
Yeah, we're gonna go down a rabbit trail.
No Derrida.
Sorry, this is for all of you out there who don't know, that is the impetus of Chris's and mine's like deepening of our friendship. We had class together all 3 years, but like Derrida is where we both like turned to each other and we're like, we're in this together. Let's get through this.
We have three rules on this podcast. We bring up miters every week with Jeff Wonrow Designs. We do not censor our guests, and no Derrida.
I can't live by that third one.
That's borderline blasphemous.
Exactly.
So
exactly.
But if you look at that one scene, they're all outside looking at the house, and so you can view that event in that frame where Homer's looking at his house and it's burning down, and then I think it was Lisa that makes the comment that truly this was an act of God. But then some of the flame goes over to Flanders' house, but then it gets put out.
Mm-hmm.
So you can view it in that way of Homer's house burned down, and yet, throughout that whole episode, he shunned the church, shunned different religions, all those sort of things. And so, okay, this is God's response to blasphemy. But then you look at it from the inside when the fire is put out and they're inside, you change that frame completely from, despite the fact of Homer's brokenness, people still come to his aid. And yeah, his house got charred more than Flanders, but he started the fire to begin with. And so there's a sense of we are going to fall victim to some of our own choices, like it or not. Yet throughout that, the hope is the community, whoever's in that community, is still going to rally around each other and do the best we can to help step in. And so two different ways of looking at that fire and Homer and how that plays out.
Well, yeah. And I think, it's as what does it mean to be called to your vocation, right? Like, and what does it mean to, to be called into faith or just community. In 2012, I went blind on Easter Sunday in an in-home accident, which I had come from church, so it's like the theophany, why do the bad things happen to the people, like I had come in, I was in my church clothes when this whole thing happened. And the only reason I can see today is because my doctors were Jewish. They did not see that day as a holiday, and they were the number one eye surgeons in the entire world. And I just happened to be, pulled into their operating room. And it's the only reason I have sight in my left eye. And so, like, in the end, the fact that there are people who were not in church that day, who were not, did not feel that sense of obligation to sit in a pew, but felt a sense of obligation to build and, be a part of community in a larger sense. It's the only reason that the Simpsons house didn't entirely burn, that, that Homer is alive, that the cat survived, like all the things.
There it is too, because he wasn't saved by the fire department. He was saved by the volunteer fire department.
Yeah.
There's this idea that there is a vigilance and it's dedication to the community and for the community by the community, rather than a service that is paid for with tax dollars, like a bear patrol. I don't pay the bear tax. I pay the Homer tax. That's the homeowner tax. Sorry, it's a good reference to a different one.
That's a great episode too. I love that.
Right. Like we could do like 400 episodes of 2-on-1 on each episode of The Simpsons, but Spiff would be miserable.
That's a different podcast that I'll let the two of you two do.
Oh, okay. But within that, the volunteer thing and people who aren't in the church, what then? There's this thing about evangelism that kind of like creeps in, right? So we get God said to Noah, there's going to be a floody. We get Pastor Lovejoy making a home visit. We get, do you want to join my religion? No, Homer. Once a snake handler, always a snake handler, which
I loved that.
And he says, I was born a snake handler. I'm going to die a snake handler. It's really funny because, yes, you probably will. That will be the thing that will kill you.
And then with Ganesh, and I mean, like, there are with Apu and Ganesh in Hinduism. And what if it's as simple as saying, I found meaning in this. Do you want to be a part of it? As opposed to, well, you should come sit by me in the pew in church and freeze to death with us as we hear a long sermon about hell. Yeah.
And Krusty the Clown, his character really isn't evangelizing like, hey, come join. He's just, trying to gather funds to help support the, I'm guessing has got to be a very, very small cross-section of the Jewish population that also happen to be clowns. That he's representing that also died in some
unless Springfield might be in. No, never mind. I had a joke that a friend of mine would laugh at, but I don't think I can actually land it. Right. But that's brotherhood, and that's community taking care of community, and that's still an invitation to participate in something that's meaningful.
Yes.
Also, a shout out to that one guy on Twitter who doesn't think I exist because I'm a gay Christian, and the fact
I was gonna bring up the clown.
I asked, "Who's this clown?" and he replied, and Spiff is like, "How are you replying to somebody who doesn't exist?" And I said, "I just think it's neat. You can take all your Twitter followers and drive them around in one tiny car," which I thought was a pretty good gag. Thank you.
It was no, I like that too. Again, we touch on the different of what it means to be in community. What does it mean, what does it mean to be faithful to something other than yourself, which is, I really think that the point of what they're trying to make is like, be a good person and, just be your best self and do that both in local and global communities.
And that's maybe, so I want to circle back around to jerk ass Homer and forgive me, listeners who may be scandalized by that phrase. That's literally how they refer to it, or they call it zombie Simpsons. After about season 8 and midway through season 8, arguably with Arlo Tanzarian and Seymour Skinner's double life that they never address again, there becomes Homer starts to go on steroids and just being a jerk. In this episode, he's selfish, he's gluttonous, he is completely self-concerned, but he also is chased by the Flanders. He's acted upon as well as he acts upon, and he becomes a caricature of himself, as does Ned Flanders with his religiosity in later seasons, and it's almost a betrayal of the progress that could possibly be made. And I think that's that maybe is a question about discipleship or accountability or transformation. How do we become better as individuals in community, as communities, in corporates in the world?
I think this episode itself, I mean, there's things you can pull out of that kind of go at that question and answer it. I think that the most basic way of answering it from my vantage point is really trying to, for ourselves, to really expand this idea of what does it mean to be involved in a religious community? How do we allow for these spaces for everybody to figure out what is their space look like? Mm-hmm. What does their involvement look like? And especially now, does that mean, okay, I need to be at church physically every Sunday, or I'm going to be joining online, or you know what? I'm not going to join online on Sunday. On Tuesday evening, I'm going to watch the replay, but I'm still going to be engaged. And all of us as a whole really being okay with everybody kind of figuring out, okay, how am I going to exist in a religious community now? What's right for me? And at the same time, really trying to watch and hold ourselves accountable to not do what Homer does, to allow that little crack in the door to eventually turn into, okay, now I'm just going to do whatever feels good in the moment. And so how do we get better is, as I'm watching that episode, I'm remembering how church used to be, and I guess how church maybe still is for some communities. How do we get better is how do we not do the service that Lovejoy does every Sunday? I mean, if you've seen enough episodes, you know, like that's his model of the worship service is that every Sunday he's going to go down some of these passages that you would never preach on.
There's he preaches about constancy.
Well, and it's one of those things that I thought about, like, this is, again, what pushes, I got why Homer didn't, we started that again. If you're watching the service, which is where you kind of start, right? Like, you know why Homer does not want to go, because it's just about how, it's just the damned, right? It is just about how, even though he's using Lamentations, which poetically is destructive, but it's more about empire, again, context. I was curious about how I think it's the only scriptural reference is Lamentations, right? At the very beginning, but that the Bible is not actually weaponized and used as a part of like the arsenal of getting people back into church or to do something. No,
but Lovejoy at dinner says, I'll remind you, Matthew 7, whatever.
Oh, that's right.
Sand, and Homer throws back, which every Bible I've ever had since then, I always highlight Matthew 21:17. And he returned to Bethany, and there he stayed there.
Yeah, think about it.
Right.
But fine. Yes, but that's also so the only person you're hearing really scripture from, though, is the pastor, not the entire community, which in my experience has been like when people want you to do something, like they weaponize and utilize the Bible in a way that is like, well, you know, you think of this, but have you ever read this scripture? Maybe it's just me as a woman pastor. I don't know, that people love to question, have I read this scripture to consider my thoughts? And it's like, you know, I have, but that wasn't happening here. It's more about a desire to turn towards each other, not necessarily because it's scripted in this book. At least that's not for a pastor who utilizes damnation and like obligatory, you know, kind of an obligatory understanding of what it means to come to church and be in church. Like, he did not hand his flock the weapon of the Bible to also kind of, you know, cull the sheep. So,
yeah. And while they're at the dinner table, now clearly you can take what Lovejoy's saying with the Matthew 7 passage as, you know, an encouragement for Homer to get back into the church, but you could also consider it another way altogether, which the scripture that he gives him was actually a pretty good scripture in light of where Homer was. And just understanding there's a number of ways that could play out. It could play out that, okay, because of that, if I'm going to respond to that, I am going to come back to church on Sunday. Or it could be, in light of that scripture, maybe I'm not coming back to church on Sunday, but at the very least, I'm going to stop living my life like a glutton, and I'm just chasing my own desire. That I'm building myself on a firm foundation of understanding real community, which eventually he does experience. Whether he and Homer, usually doesn't. He misses the point more often than he gets it. But I hadn't thought about that before, Spiff. But you're right. Like the Bible in this episode is not necessarily weaponized in that way,
which is kind of nice. It's a good.
It was just nice. I mean, I took that as like, it's really nice when like the interactions about why you need to be in church are authentically because the people are better because you're there, and not because let me just flap open a scripture passage and it's like because God says so, right? Because what God is actually saying in this episode comes from God, not necessarily through scripture, which I really appreciated. For an aged old white God who's going to come down and talk, I'll take it. But I don't know. I think more people would come to church. I mean, right. As pastors, that's the age old question. How do you get more people in church? I think more people are going to come into the fold if given the opportunity to go elsewhere, and we make it meaningful to be present here, to say, we are better because of you, you are better because of us. And it actually has nothing to do with this transactional understanding, but like, because forward together, because, this is what we are called to do.
Yeah. If what you're doing is meaningful and it has value, and it's speaking an important language that a person needs to hear, they're going to come. And I think that's part of what we've experienced over the last, 20, 30 years since this episode, is that idea of that Marge had of, well, you have to go to church. You have to, is kind of a moving away. Well, no, we don't have to. And so now the church has not been able to just hang their hat on people are going to come because it's an obligation. Well, guess what? It's not an obligation anymore. So that means the thing that we're doing, it needs to have value, needs to have meaning. It can't be this thing that we do just by rote. It's got to add value somehow.
Absolutely. And it all has to have value, and who gets to decide what that value is entirely different. That, at the park, we identify most often as one of those justice-seeking churches, right? And so, I will say we see an uptick in our attendance when big things happen in the world, like women lose rights for themselves, or big leadership changes and things like that. We have people that come into our church because we've set the table of welcome for them to express their grief, their sorrow, and to look forward towards hope. That is not true for every church. Sometimes if you are a church that has contextualized the Bible in different ways and understands that differently, you may lose people if you start to speak on it. I don't know. And so it's about that extravagant welcome and who you are. Arthur says this all the time, right? The church needs to know who it is and lean into that. We can't be the church for all people. Every church can't be for every single human, because then you're for nobody. Right. Because you've got to make that niche. And I think that is what we really start to see pointed back to here, right? Is that you've got to meet the needs of the Homers and the Marges, who are living in the same house, raising the same children, but have very different faith needs.
Yeah.
Amen.
There you go. But speaking of how we utilize the Bible, or how it is and is not utilized in this space, we use it every week with at least our final question. Chris, it is really good to see you, my friend, and I am so grateful that you have come on. I hope that you will come back and give Arthur at least another person to talk Simpsons to.
You bet.
So, absolutely.
Hearts has been broken at this point. This is great. So
this is either going to be wonderful or terrible for me as both of your friends. So, I'm kidding.
Wonderful.
It'll be wonderful for everyone. I love it.
Yeah.
But Chris, what biblical scene, person, character, book are you most reminded of in Simpsons, Homer the Heretic?
Okay, so this is a stretch. It's a stretch, but just go with me on it. Judges chapter 4. It's the story of Deborah, the judge, and how that narrative plays out. The general of the Canaanite army, Sisera, he's the bad guy in the story, and actually really bad guy. But the way that chapter rolls out, when I see that scene at the end of The Simpsons, and you see all of this odd group of collection of people creating the victory for Homer, like that's what I see happening in the Deborah story, with Deborah, the judge, on one part of the Israelite world, and then Barak, the leader of the Israelite army, on the other part of the Israelite world, who's actually, at the time of the story begins, he's living in a sanctuary city. So that means he's in a place for people that are hiding from the fighting. Mm-hmm. And then Jael, who's not even an Israelite altogether, she's a Kenite. And these three people coming together, just this odd pairing, this odd grouping of people working together, not for any one specific person's glory, but just because we've got a job to do. Let's get it done. And there was, throughout that whole chapter, there's never a feeling of animosity or what about me? It's just, we've got this thing to do, and we're going to go do it. And as that episode unfolds, that's kind of how they tie a bow to this episode, is this community coming together, not for any one person's glory, but because, hey, there's a thing to do. Let's go do it. So there you go.
I did not think when I woke up today preparing to talk about season 4, episode 3 of The Simpsons, that we would tie in driving a tent peg through somebody's head. But here we are.
I mean, I feel like this answer, for those of you that couldn't have put this together, this is why Chris and I are friends. Like, that answer was, I was like, he's going Jael and Deborah and Judges is chef's kiss golden for this. That was great.
Thank you.
Arthur, you want to go? Because that was so good.
I'm going to throw out Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego, and the furnace.
Yeah.
Because the fire is perilous, but it's never really going to kill Homer. Like, they never have to rebuild the house. It is a plot device. It is supposed to show the faithfulness of God. And I will absolutely say that Flanders is person number 4 in the furnace. And that's why he wasn't in church, because he was actually embodying the Son of Man in that moment.
Right.
Yep.
That's good too.
Wow.
All right. So, I could go one of two ways. I was gonna go, as we were talking through this, I thought burning bush and how God also, in the non-consuming of the fire, the fire that did not consume but was used to speak, I was like, there's something there. But I think I'm gonna stick with my original, which is John 1, in the beginning was the word, because I think that the word in which, how you write this script of The Simpsons, how you write every piece of this, how you allow the dialogue to be so expansive of what God can and is doing, and how it continues to still speak in a way that is beyond what any kind of normative definition would have, is laid bare here in Homer and God's relationship, in the community building, that it is so expansive and yet confined to our humanness. And so for me, I was like, very much like, oh, we're given the word of God made flesh in this space that was and is and always was and always is and is to come and all of that, and here we go. And you never know what God is going to say to Homer. I've got to go, show up to in a tortilla. I've got to go do this and that what God was capable of and how God showed up was so much more than anything that we could have anticipated with just a linear narrative of the work of God.
Yeah.
What's the meaning of life? Homer, you can't know that before you die. But I want to know now. You can't wait.
Wait 6 months.
Can't wait 6 months.
Well, friends, this has been 2 on 1, where we've dove deep and wide into Homer the Heretic on The Simpsons. Hey, a reminder that you can dive deep and wide into the best liturgical textiles money can buy and the world offers at jeffwonrow.com, JEFFWUNROW.com. Use our promo code 2on115 at checkout for an additional 15% off your entire store order. I guess it's not additional, for 15% off your entire store order. We'll be back.
You don't have to wait 6 months. We will be back next week.
Yes, we will. And until then, I am the Reverend Arthur Stewart.
I'm the Reverend Stephanie Kendall.
I'm the Reverend Chris Bohon.
And
Yes,
friends, the meaning of life is get more 2-on-1 at 2on1project.com.